That is so sweet. We're so fortunate to have such a great group of musicians in our midst. Is that not true? I mean, that's true. I'm blessed every time I come here. I don't know about you guys. So here's a little something real quick in the category of the kids say the darndest things. So a kid is outside in the playground area outside of Sunday school during a break. His teacher's watching through the door and notices that this kid is clearly intimidating the other kids around him. He's making these ugly faces at them and taunting them. And she watches for a while until after a while she feels like she's just got to intervene. So she goes out, and Miss Smith, the teacher, she smiles at the boy and she says, I just have to say, when I was a kid, I was always told that when you make faces like that, it's going to stick with you forever. And the boy looked up and said, well, at least you were warned. Is that mean? I don't know. I like that because in a sense, I want to see the humorous side to what's happening in the gospel. Because Jesus is just finished with the disciples on one side of the lake of the Sea of Galilee, basically an oversized, like a great lake. And he says, we're going to get in the boat and we're going to go to the other side. Now, immediately that says a couple of things. First of all, the Sea of Galilee, very deep, prone to storms. It's going to be a little tedious, going to be a little iffy. That's just a given. But secondly, he says, because we're going to go to the other side. And the other side is a whole different group of people. They tend to be more Gentiles. They tend to be more unrelated to the Jewish community that was on the side where they were talking. So now they're going to go to unfamiliar territory. And in the middle of that, the storm comes, and everybody panics. They all freak out, and they look over Jesus, and he's sleeping with a smile on his face. And they're waking him up in this terror. Well, it's as if when he finally woke up, he says, have you no faith? He might as well have said, I warned you. You should have seen it coming. The whole point of what was happening right before he crossed over was he was redefining the narrative of those people. The disciples' very cultural narrative, he was redefining it. They'd all grown up with Pharisees, with Pharisaic training, with traditional Jewish training from the Deuteronomic covenant. They all understood the whole reality of who was in, who was out, and Jesus tells these two parables right before they cross over. Where Mark places them is interesting because Mark says Jesus is telling them a parable of the mustard seed. And if you've ever read the parable of the mustard seed, basically the kingdom of God is like a weed that's going to take over everything. Because none of the farmers would want a mustard seed growing in the middle of a garden. Now, mustard provide a great spice, but you have to set it apart. It's got its own place to be. Jesus says, no, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. It's going to come in, going to take over everything. Birds are going to come fly in it. It's not going to be anything like you like. It's going to sort of mess up everything. That's the kingdom of God. Then right before that, another great parable, the kingdom of God is like a sower who's gathering seeds. Some's going to hit dirt. Some's going to hit rock. Some's going to be left out there, and birds are going to come and pick it up, take it away. The kingdom of God is vulnerable. They get out in the middle of this lake, and the storm strikes. And here's the interesting thing about this storm. These are fishermen, right? A storm shouldn't bother them. It's a stormy sea. So if you look up the word of what they're saying when Jesus says, why are you afraid? He's not saying, why are you afraid of all this horrible stuff? He's saying, why are you such a coward? He's basically calling them a coward because they failed to see what was being told to them. They failed to incorporate it. They still don't get the fact that they're living by a narrative that is completely destructive, completely separatist, isolating. And Jesus has brought in this whole new narrative that says it's going to take over everything. God's love is already here. Everybody's a part of it. All of the divisions don't exist. And they can't get it. And I tell you, honestly, if you're pretty comfortable where you are and you like some of these divisions, well, the kingdom of God's going to mess it up, because that's what it's all about. That's what Jesus' whole narrative and stories in life have been about, turning those comfort zones upside down and encouraging us to step across. I love that image. We're going to cross over. The great myths, if there's one thing you can get from these cautionary tales like Echo and Narcissus, is that they're all about initiation. And in this case, they're cautionary tales because they're about failure to initiate. They're about failure to recognize the call to your authentic self. And the consequence is disastrous. Because if you're not truly connected to your authentic, truest self, then what story are you living by? That's where we get in trouble, is it not? When we start identifying ourselves with all the stories around us in culture, we become susceptible to all of those limitations, divisions, prejudices, divisiveness, duality. We fail to see what we're being called to. So Jesus isn't trying to say, just trust in God because God's going to solve all the storms. Again, this is nothing unusual. Storms are normal. What he's saying here is that you failed to realize what this is all about once again. And now you're afraid to pursue it because it's unknown, it's mysterious. And in reality, it threatens things. I want to suggest a couple of things. Over the next several weeks as we pursue this, as we kind of take a look at this series, I've been playing around with these stories that we live by and these cultural tales that sort of define who we are. But I want to suggest that one of the things we have to come to recognize is the stories that are destructive in our lives. Time and time again, we fail to see them until they crop up like an ugly crisis. They crop up like a crazy guy walking into a church in a prayer meeting and shooting 9 people. And it's tragic. And it's terrible. And we can't imagine what was in Ruth's mind. We can't imagine. And when we get scared of a group of Muslims because we can identify them as terrorists, or we get scared of a certain race because we can identify them as thugs and different and just in general a problem, we see a white guy and we think, this is crazy. The person is crazy. Hate crimes are crazy. It's a mental illness. And we fail to see that one of the biggest problems we have in our world, in our culture, is that we still identify by this narrative that says we are different. This narrative that we're born with, that we grow into, that we have no choice really. It's how we are born. We're born into cultures, we're born into communities, we're born into families, we're born into identities that separate us from others. And we fail to see that sometimes. And then we're surprised and shocked that something so horrific can crop up. And we should be shocked. We should be deeply, deeply wounded. The African Methodist Episcopal Church is a branch off from the United Methodist Church. These are brothers and sisters in the ecclesiastical sense of the word for us. 4 clergy people were killed that night. It hits hard, it hits close to home. And our hearts will certainly be going out, and no doubt all week long you've probably been seeing it and sharing with others. But maybe you're like a lot of people too, and all week long eventually you find yourself sort of trying to sublimate it, sort of trying to move it aside because it's a painful reality. And like so many of these storms and these painful realities, if we can pocket them somewhere, then we don't have to think too much. Because it's hard to be thinking about it all the time. But at the heart of it, I think what Jesus is saying in this story, what he's been saying in his ministry, what the kingdom of God is about changing that narrative. It's about seeing things not black and white, not us and them, not me and my ability to attain some kind of successful future, and then whoever it else is that I'm either in competition with or sort of peripherally hoping to help. But in reality, I still judge myself by those competitive models, narrative stories. Why? Because I grew up in a us and them, a we and they, a me and him or her. And Jesus is saying, the Samaritan, that person you dislike, that person that's anathema to you, they're part of God's creation, same as you, all part of the same creation. And Christ saying, when you see the stranger, you see me, it's because we're all part of one another. We're all connected. It's not about trying to see what's real and not real. It's about trying to simply be present and realizing there's a mystery there we don't understand. I had this great experience a couple of days ago. I was at a museum and I was telling stories, and it was all these precocious kids. And I like watching kids because that's where it happens, right? You see the children when they're youngest and they're all open and they're playing with one another. There's no distinction, there's no definition. They're just in the midst of play. They're just in the midst of presence and discovery. And it doesn't take long before they begin to understand who's who and what's what and what's mine and what's not. So here's this 10-year-old, and I'm telling a story, and I talk about how we're going to have a big party, and it's going to be chaos and fun and crazy, off-the-hook, wild party, and there's going to be all sorts of crowds. It'll be wonderful. And then I said, but I'm going to be all by myself in this story. And I said, can I have a party? Can I have a party? Can you have a party when you're all by yourself? Can it be off-the-hook, crazy, wild party when you're all by yourself? And they're all going like, no. Can't do that. And then I said, well, you can if you use your, and they all chime in, imagination. And then one 10-year-old looks over and says, and I love it, precocious kid, he raises his hand and says, actually, that is not the case. That in reality, that's just fantasy, and it's not actually real. It's just make-believe. So you really can't have a party with a bunch of people when you're all by yourself because you're all by your... I mean, he just gets into explaining this. His mom, of course, is sitting there going like, shh, she's trying to calm him down. Be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. And I'm going like, let's invite this moment of enlightenment. So I look at him, and he's reading this awesome book. He's clearly beyond his age in reading. He's reading this massive fantasy novel, and I can't tell you who the author was, but it's like a Harry Potter, one of the newest sort of versions of that. Wonderful. I look at it, and I said, so what are you reading? He tells me the title. I said, so do you like it? And he says, I love it. And I said, well, what do you like about it? He says, it's exciting. He says, it's adventurous. He says, it's wonderful. And then he starts describing, there's scary places in it. And I said, so you get scared sometimes? He said, yeah, I feel scared sometimes. I said, you get excited? Yeah, it gets exciting. And I said, are those feelings real? And he stops. And he says, yeah. And I said, well, then who's to say that the story you're reading is not real because you feel real feelings? And he looks at his mother like, what's happened? And his mom, I kid you not, she looks at him and she goes, and I see him later on and I smile at him. I say, welcome to the universe. And he hasn't got a clue. But in some ways he does, because that's what we have to do. That's what we have. We have to challenge one another. We have to change the narrative. I want to finish with one little thing here. I read this blog post by this senator from Colorado. Maybe you saw it as well. I want to make sure I get his name correct. Colorado State Senator Mike Johnston. He posted on the doors in Denver, Colorado, he posted on the doors of a black church there a letter in response to what happened. But he says in the letter that it was his problem. He woke up in the middle of the night thinking his problem. He was dealing with something personal because of what happened in Charleston. And so he wrote this note and tacked it on the door of Shorter Community African Methodist Episcopal Church about the shooting that had happened in Charleston. This is what he said. I drove over just to remind you and to remind myself of the words from one of America's greatest preachers and one of the Lord's greatest prophets, who said that hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. With that truth in mind, in the wake of tonight's heartless stabs of hatred, I drove here to reaffirm the overwhelming supremacy of love. And then in his post, he encouraged people who were reading to do the same. to negate that narrative, to challenge it, to turn that narrative upside down, to face the storm, to find the calm in the heart of that storm by facing it and by redefining what that is. The minute we can begin to redefine the narratives of separation that are in our world, whether it's the competitive narrative, whether it's the social Darwinist narrative, whether it's the progress narrative, the minute we can begin to redefine that in light of God's love and say that the narrative is we are all part of creation, we are all one, however we can do that, we begin changing the community around us. And I almost hesitated to want to do this song because I thought it almost feels anathema to what's happening. And then I realized that if we get to that place where we can truly share creation with one another, where we can truly experience the world and encourage the world to see that, in fact, we are all part of this creation together and we make or break it together, that when we can get to that place, this song makes complete sense. And you can join along if you